Welcome to Bill's Aviation Podcast, where your stories are our stories. I'm a general aviation pilot, aviation writer, airplane builder, avionics developer, test pilot, and general screw-up. All stories feature Joe and his merry band of miscreants. The purpose of these stories is to educate and entertain pilots. If you have a story you'd like to share anonymously, please contact me. Today's story is titled, Found a Leak. Joe and his buddy Bob had a wedding to attend in Burlington, Vermont. Since our two intrepid aviators were based in Detroit and had access to a nice Cessna 172 owned by Bob's father, they decided to fly themselves to Vermont. Joe and Bob were both in their early 20s. Although the same age, Joe was a new pilot having less than 100 hours total time, while Bob was a newly minted certified flight instructor, otherwise known as a CFI. The Friday before the wedding, Joe and Bob met at the airport just after sunrise and started loading their clothes prior to performing the pre-flight inspection. Being young bachelors, packing was a simple matter as they each had a small travel bag for their long weekend, plus wedding gifts and an empty gallon milk jug. The pre-flight found no anomalies. The tanks were topped and the engine run-up was normal, so off they went, first heading south to clear the Detroit airspace, skirting the south shore of Lake Erie and finally turning northeast. They cruised along, first over Ohio, then a little bit of Pennsylvania, and eventually into upstate New York, where they stopped to top off their fuel tanks, grab some snacks and drinks in Dunkirk before launching for the final leg to Vermont. This was Joe's leg to fly, so Bob was busy navigating and coaching Joe from the right seat as they continued their flight to the northeast. In preparation for the flight, Bob suggested Joe do all the flight planning, as it would be a good exercise for a low-time pilot such as Joe to do. One thing that Joe noted while looking over the paper sectionals, yes, this occurred before the days of GPS navigation, that some of the landmarks depicted in the New York sectional were nothing but small black square dots with cabin printed next to each of them. As Joe looked out the window for these landmarks, he quickly realized that if there were cabins down there, they were spread far and wide and they were hidden by the trees. Joe began to realize that upstate New York, it was nothing like New York City. Wow, was this place desolate. Still, 2 hours from Burlington, Bob announced that he had to go to the bathroom. Joe commented that there was no place to land and suggested Bob hold it. Not to worry, Bob said as he climbed into the back seat of the Cessna 172, and as soon as Bob moved aft, so did the center of gravity in the mighty 172, which caused the airplane to pitch up and start climbing. Joe called out to Bob to give him a second to retrim the airplane and get it back down to their assigned altitude. It was at this moment Joe realized why Bob had tossed that empty milk jug in with their luggage. As soon as Bob relieved himself in the no longer empty milk jug, Bob started cursing up a storm. This immediately got Joe's attention, and as he turned his head to see what was going on, there was Bob kneeling in the back seat, holding up the milk jug, which had a small pinhole in it, which allowed the fresh urine to shower the front of Bob's shirt. Bob commanded Joe to slow the Cessna down. Once slowed, Bob popped open the side window and pitched the leaking milk jug out. Bob then spent the remainder of the flight trying to clean himself up, while Joe sat there laughing at him. Joe has always wondered if some hunter found that jug lying in the woods, picked it up, and suffered the same fate as Bob. Lesson learned. When picking a relief tube, it might be wise to pressure test it for leaks prior to putting it to use. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed what you heard, please hit the like button and subscribe by clicking on the logo in the lower right of your screen. If you really like what you've heard, please help support this channel and become a Patreon. Part of each donation will go to aviation safety and aviation youth programs. Be sure to check out next week's story about Joe finding a unique way to carry wheel chocks.